Hey guys, so I had this piece of maple that was an offcut from a larger slab that I'd made some other tables out of, and this one had lots of bark inclusions and cracks and really wasn't in the best shape, but I had an idea for a Lazy Susan, and that's what we're doing. So I started out after flattening the slab and cutting it down. I removed all of the soft bits and the bark that was, inside here, just to give the resin a nice solid surface to bind to. After cleaning up the two pieces of wood I chose to use, I made my mold. I'm using some Tyvek tape to make sure that we don't have the resin stick to anything. I'm using my standard Pro Marine Supplies epoxy with black diamond pigments. This time I'm using a turquoise diamond effect. Thought it would look pretty good with the light color of the maple. So here I'm pouring, and off camera I'd actually caulked the edges of the mold to make sure not to have any leaks. I definitely want to do that. The tape won't do the trick, so definitely use a caulking or some sort of sealant. I ended up doing, I think it was like 2 or 3 pours to get the level of the epoxy up. This Pro Marine Supplies, they say that you should pour it about 1/4 of an inch each time, so otherwise it'll get hot and it could crack or shrink. So, like I said earlier, this slab had a bunch of nasty cracks in it and imperfections, and there was one crack in particular that went all the way through the piece of wood, so I decided to install some of these little bow ties just to keep that crack together, and they look pretty cool as well. So I start out by tracing around them just to give me a guideline of what I need to remove to install these. And I almost forgot here to mark the placement of each of the bow ties. So that's what you're seeing me do here. It's always important to do this because after you've messed around and carved the holes, it's hard to remember where they belong and you can screw up. Here I'm using the router with a plunge bit just to remove some of the material that I could. These were pretty small, so it was a little tight. Like I said, these being so small were a challenge to chisel out. This is the smallest chisel that I have currently. It's about a 1/2 inch chisel. I think in the future I need to invest in a 1/4 inch, which I think would have made this easier. It's just hard to get into these holes and clean out the material without screwing up the guidelines. But, we got it done. So after carving them out, I hammered them in with some wood glue, and I think that will keep the crack together. I used the sander just to knock them down so that they were flush with the overall the top here. And that's looking pretty good. Now you see a little gap there. A trick that I learned from watching other YouTube videos is to use some of the dust from the type of wood and wood glue, and you go ahead and just smear this into any of your cracks. And man, that way it looks like it was perfect and nobody will ever know. Alright, so don't go telling anybody. So I filled the crack with the same turquoise colored epoxy that I had with the rest of the pour, just to keep the overall color and style of this Lazy Susan. So here I'm marking the center so that I can cut out a perfect circle using this circle cutting jig for my router. So I marked the center point. Identify the radius of the circle, and I'm using a 1/4 inch bit in my router to just rotate around. I think I did like a depth of maybe 1/4 inch each pass just to prevent tear out, and this way I can cut out a perfect circle pretty easy, and it looks nice. Yeah, that's looking good. So I had another piece of maple from the same tree, and I used this and a similar trick with the circle jig to cut out the bottom. So we're going to have the bottom, the hardware in between, and then the top. I gave both the top and the bottom a 1/2 inch round over just to smooth everything out and make the edges a little bit softer. After sanding everything down, there were some air bubbles and just little places where the original pour of epoxy hadn't filled. So here I used a 5-minute epoxy and a little paintbrush just to fill in any areas that didn't have enough epoxy to fill them in, just to try to finish this off and, make me happy. And then I branded it and it was off to finish. So this was my second time using a product called Rubio Monaco. And it's a hard wax finish that's traditionally used on hardwood floors, but it's become more popular with furniture. So it's a single coat finish. You mix it, wipe it on liberally, and wipe off all the excess, and it's done. So the process is nice and simple. So I have the Lazy Susan hardware here, and I made a template with the screw holes just to help me apply this and install it correctly so I wasn't messing up the actual hardware. And I used the same center point when I cut out the circles with the circle cutting jig. Now the trick with these Lazy Susan type hardware is that you got to cut a little peek hole so that you can actually screw the hardware into your second layer. So I've got that little hole here that lines up with the screw holes so that I can get in there and attach it to the top. A little tricky, but after a few times I did get it installed and we're looking good. So I was really pleased with how this came out. What I pictured in my mind is pretty much what we actually got here. Kind of an artsy piece. If you like it, please leave a comment. And as always, I appreciate your time in watching.